Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see many familiar faces and some new ones. A warm welcome to our seminar on experimentation and digital technology in banking security. My name is Marieke de Goede. I'm the principal investigator of Project Follow, which tries to follow the suspicious transaction from bank to court. And I'm also a co-coordinator of the Global Digital Cultures Research Priority Area at the University of Amsterdam. I'm going to hand over to Carola Westermeijer, who is chairing this session. Carola is a lecturer at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, and she was formerly a postdoctoral researcher at Project Follow with a focus on financial expertise. So Carola, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Marieke, and thank you for bringing us together. I think it's good to say, or notable to just to notice, that Marieke is probably the one who brought us all together, because she brings together the Project Follow and also Global Digital Cultures, which provides this platform here. So again, hi everyone, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm really happy to see lots of familiar faces and some new names, and yeah, I hope to have a wonderful discussion in this webinar on how banks experiment with digital technologies and how they detect suspicious transaction. So one thing I need to mention is that this webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be put on, so the recording is going to be placed on the website of Global Digital Cultures, and probably also on the YouTube channel of Global Digital Cultures, and also on the Follow website. So just so that you're aware that you are being recorded with this webinar. And also the speakers will be recorded, and we have three wonderful speakers who will contribute with their expertise and who have very interesting different perspectives on the topic, and they have all prepared a short presentation in which they will talk about their research and their perspective on the field. So our first speaker today is Esme Bosma, who's a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam, and also part of the Project Follow group. And for her PhD, she studies how banks counter-terrorist financing in practice, and she focuses on the mediating role of technologies. And she analyzes how knowing customer practices, transaction monitoring technologies, and public-private financial information sharing also happen in this sphere. Then our second speaker here, this is the beautiful thing about the digital gatherings that we have at the moment, is Vanessa Yuffala. She's with us here from Canada, where also summer has started just as in Western Europe. And Vanessa is assistant professor at the University of Toronto. She holds a doctorate in criminology and socio-legal studies from the University of Toronto. And currently she's working on a pilot project that examines anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing practices by individuals working in real estate. So very interesting sector here. And she's also already given multiple expert testimony to several governmental reviews, and also given presentations on money laundering at various industry and academic conferences. So she's really truly a bridge between those fields in a way. And our third speaker today is Malcolm Campbell-Worden, who is a senior researcher fellow at the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg and the Center for Global Cooperation and Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, and who's also an assistant professor in international political economy at the Department of International Relations and International Organizations at the University of Groningen. His research traces the varying implications of big data and blockchain technologies at the intersections of global environmental, financial, and security governance. So he will be the expert for these new technologies that everyone's so keen to understand, and that there are so many discussions about. So what we're going to do, as I said, we are going to hear three short presentations, And then obviously we will open the discussion to the audience, and really, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but you can also raise your virtual hand, and then yeah, we get the discussion going. So feel free to ask questions after the presentations, or if you have any anything you want to know from the presenters regarding their presentations, feel free to ask questions. So I will hand over to Esme for the first presentation. Esme, please.
Yeah, thank you, Carola, for the introduction. And also thank you to Sinine from Global Digital Cultures and Asma, the research assistant of Follow, who helped with the organization of the webinar. Let me find my PowerPoint. Yeah, so so in this presentation, I will draw my PhD research into the role of banks and how they are legally obliged to counter terrorist financing. And the main argument of the presentation will be that in order to detect terrorist financing, banks need to experiment with digital security technologies. So banks are regarded as gatekeepers of the financial system. They are legally obliged to do customer research, to monitor transactions of every customer, and also to report unusual or suspicious transactions to financial intelligence units. The next webinar will be about financial intelligence units on the 23rd of June, but I'm sure Carola will announce that later as well. And in my dissertation for my research, I specifically focus on the role of technologies in this context. And today I will mainly draw on one chapter about automated transaction monitoring systems that are supposed to detect these potential terrorist financing transactions. So briefly about my research methods. In order to study how they do this in practice, I've done fieldwork in the Netherlands and in the UK. Large part of the fieldwork was done during a 3-month research internship at a major Dutch bank. And I've also participated in anti-money laundering conferences and international stakeholder workshops around the topics of financial crime. And I triangulated these findings with webinars and document analysis. Furthermore, about research, about the research methods and how the study of technology is quite challenging. There's my book chapter in the Secrecy and Methods in Security book on sites of experimentation. So why, firstly, this focus on digital security technologies? So if you want to understand how banks counter terrorist financing, it actually looks like this: a person behind a computer, like so many of us. Security practices are often reliant on both humans and also technologies, like the transaction monitoring system that I will discuss today. So technologies enable or constrain security in practice. And there's also political choices, ethical choices, technical choices during the design and use of these technologies. So as a conceptual framework, I built on science and technology studies, specifically on the study by Madeleine Eckridge and her studies into the design and use of technical objects, in my case, transaction monitoring system. So her framework is that designers inscribe a certain functionalities and assumptions in a technological object, in a technology, and the script is then mediates a certain framework of action in which the user can use this technology. In her case, which is a study of 1992, she follows the design of a photoelectric lamp, its design in France, and how this is actually used in practice, where it was intended to be used in Africa. And she finds basically that the designers did not anticipate certain practical functionalities, like the batteries were not available for them to be replaced, and other kind of technical things. So the intended use of the system did not actually match its use in practice. So I find this framework of design and use very helpful to understand also how technologies are used in the financial crime context. And that's what I will turn to now. So this is then a simplified overview of the transaction monitoring system. Ideally, the script or the goal of this technology is to detect potential terrorist financing transactions. The system needs to generate alerts that are processed by analysts in banks. And if they are indeed suspicious or related to money laundering or terrorist financing potentially, they need to be sent to the national financial intelligence units. If you look at the overview, you see on the left the designers that can be several people who are involved in the tuning of these systems. So, for example, tooling teams in banks, they also deliberate with compliance officers, financial crime experts that are both working in the bank or in consultancies, and they need to or software developers actually, and they need to inscribe, first of all, the system needed to be designed, of course, and then they also need to inscribe predictions about what might constitute a potential terrorist financing behavior. This is then out of the financial transactions, which you see in the left of the middle, then via scenarios, thresholds, and algorithmic rules, need to decide which transactions are actually flagged. And then an alert will follow that hopefully then points to an unusual transaction. So the actual functioning of the system mostly functions on algorithmic rules like if X, then an alert will be generated. For example, you can think of if a transaction to a high-risk jurisdiction takes place, or if a transaction for a sum of 10,000 euros or more that exchanges cash into wire transfers or other currencies, for example. Now, these are only examples, but you can think that in the X, different indicators can be filled in. This is also where you can see the inherent experimentation to this system that constantly needs to be updated, also with recent threats and recent typologies. Well, the users on the right then have to analyze these alerts and decide whether it's indeed unusual. Ideally, the information or the effectiveness or the amount of alerts that are processed on the user side and whether they are useful also feedback into the designer. That's why you can see the arrow that also goes back to the designer. But from the analyst on the right, it would go to the financial intelligence units, which is not in this schematic overview. So if you look at this, how does this actually work in practice? Well, what I found out during my fieldwork is that these business rules in the forms of if-then are geared towards simple financial transaction data, such as amount of sender or recipient. And terrorist financing is actually hard to detect based on such characteristics. The amounts of money are often small, and terrorism can also be financed by legitimate money, for example. So this is one of the reasons why for banks, it's very hard to detect terrorist financing via these traditional transaction monitoring systems that are called rules-based transaction monitoring systems. So the problem is that on the side of the user, there are many false positives. So these often the amount of, or the percentage of 90 or 95% false positives is being mentioned in relation to this system. Well, so to conclude this system and the technological efficiency is subject to constant experimentation and deliberation by everybody who is involved into tuning this system. Now, what to conclude, in order to detect terrorist financing, banks experiment with digital security technologies. But actually the design does not work in practice. So the intended use of the system to detect these potential terrorist financing related transactions does not actually work so well in practice because terrorist financing threats are difficult to detect. Secondly, the expectation that banks can currently prevent terrorist financing without concrete leads can therefore be regarded as unrealistic. So the anti-money laundering, the AML reporting system is inefficient across the chain. And also the system has unintended consequences where if banks need to define risks themselves in the risk-based approach, which I did not speak about today, but can have unintended consequences like the de-risking of high-risk customers, such as charities. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Esme. Perfect timekeeping and a great start to this discussion on experimentation. So Vanessa, you also have a presentation to share, and please go ahead.
I do. All right, I'm going to share the screen. Here we have. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I really enjoyed Esme's presentation, not least because it corroborates things that I'm going to say, and it's always nice to feel like you're hitting the same notes as other people who work in your field. So thanks for that. That was quite delightful. So let's begin. Let's figure out how to make this begin. There we have it. To give you a very quick overview of course, thank you, Apple Music, for coming into my presentation. I would not like to start listening. Sorry if you can see that. I apologize. Apparently, Apple Music thinks it's more engaging than my own presentation. So now, as we know, the banks have become sort of the largest piece of the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, data production chain. It has become quite the substantial and significant undertaking. Retail financial institutions have created entire departments, AML, financial investigations units, entire technological apparatuses that are meant to identify potential financiers of terrorism. And the way that this works is that we see two distinct yet interrelated streams of data production. One stream, which is conceived of as being produced directly by humans, the UTR to STR human-generated chain, and those that are conceived of as being produced by more sort of neutral technologies and practices. And here we're talking about data mining and the AML CTF rules of which Esme spoke. Now, these both result jointly or separately in the identification and classification of risky financial transactions and risky persons as related to financial crime. We are meant to understand that this process is undertaken in the public interest and that it's supposed to unfold in accordance with industry and institutional best practices. And I'd like to offer you my own critique or my own ideas about the way in which we go about doing this, that how we identify and classify financial transactions as risks is not as objective as we're meant to believe. And that if we sort of unpack the idea of subjectivity and risk, that perhaps we can create a system that is not as full as static as we, at least in the Canadian context, are beginning to see. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about this. Part of the reason for the developing of the system in this way, one angle of this is the increasing international pressure that we've seen sort of since the 90s to follow the money. But the idea here is that because the banks are the nexus, it's the financial flows and the big data that they're able to amass that make them sort of the perfect space for this. In Canada, in the post-2000, especially post-2001 landscape, we've seen the development and significant expansion of FINTRAC, our anti-money laundering reporting center. And FINTRAC trades in the currency of the suspicious transaction report, which, as we all know, in banking is preceded by the UTR. So we've got this expansion of mandatory reporting or third-party policing that we're seeing in this space, wherein suspiciousness, best practices, and knowledge are delegated to industries and businesses by the law. So the law leaves it up to each business, each sector, each industry to determine what is or is not suspicious. Now, policymakers and bankers alike have come to see that the production of data about clients and client financial activities is crucial to this enterprise. However, nobody seems to have twigged to the fact that the outcomes and implications for the way this data and this knowledge is produced about transactions, about clients, can have real serious consequences for the people who come under scrutiny and for the effectiveness of this system. And Esme spoke a bit about de-risking as one consequence, and I think more public discussion. So I apologize for this very lovely flow chart that is going to be fun for you to follow. But essentially what we have here is the way in which the UTR is generated within financial institutions. Now, the AML FIU, this space here, is understood to be the hub of institutional data, right? This is where knowledge about what's risky is produced. This is where processes of governance and risk management are developed and rolled out. So we have the human side, we have the place where people are involved in producing data about client risk. You start at the teller or at the individual who's processing the transaction. We go all the way into the right here, right? Client produces the transaction. We have the employee who considers its suspiciousness, files the UTR. Then we also have the side of the internal investigations process wherein they decide whether or not to file the STR. Gets sent to FINTRAC, or it sort of lives in its sort of limbo forever state in the database until it gets touched again and perhaps is renewed for a second, slightly zombie-esque life. We also have the analytics side, which relies on rules, techniques of data generation, data mining, those kinds of things that populate databases about client activity. So things that pop up as being outside of normative parameters or which coincide with information about problematic client identities, things provided by third-party vendors, show up here in this space as well. Regardless, as I've said, these reports take on a life of their own. Once they exist, once they come into being, they exist regardless, whether they're substantiated as suspicious or not. Because maybe today they're not suspicious, but perhaps tomorrow they might be. They're kept on file for quality control purposes, for record keeping purposes. And so in this way, suspicion and non-suspicion sort of live and exist permanently in the same space, regardless of the veracity of that suspicion. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about these. We have the branch UTR generated stream. Here, in this stream, in the context of the teller and client interaction, we see the production of unusual transaction reports. This stream exists because in law, bank employees are understood to be expert knowers about suspicious financial transactions and people with a unique possibility for intelligence. And this is not just about financial activity, but really about scrutinizing the person who is there, right? Am I looking at a legitimate person or a legitimate terrorist or criminal? And even though it's not meant to be about suspicious persons, it's clear, at least in the Canadian context, from presentations that I've seen given by speakers representing FinTrack that it may be a focus on suspicious transactions is what's in the law, but it's people who conduct those transactions. So there's value in generating data about suspicious behavior by suspicious people, not just about what they're doing with the money, but sort of to borrow from Goffman, what's the presentation of self? And so to that end, I've been informed in interviews that the following things are suspicious. So I'm just going to give you maybe some handy tips for avoiding problems at the teller counter if you, as academics, seem to have $10,000 or more Canadian kicking around, which we all know that you don't, but if that should ever happen. Wearing your sunglasses inside, wearing a hoodie, wearing a suit, being in a hurry, taking a long time, being friendly, not being friendly enough, being surly, being Muslim, or being me, because I was also questioned about my ethnicity during my interviews, which was a fun moment for me. Interestingly, nobody cottoned on to the fact that I'm Italian, and so perhaps there's like an organized crime element that they should be concerned about, but once they realized that I was Caucasian, it was mostly smooth sailing. I give you this list because any and all of these are sufficient for reporting a client's financial transaction. And on the face of it, they're not really objectively or rationally connected to financial crime, right? Like either the money laundering or the terrorist financing side. What we see here is sort of like an early stage tendency toward defensive reporting, right? Where people are encouraged to report the most minimally suspicious or minimally interesting aspects of transactions. And this is consistent with the see something, say something logic that's dominant in securitized contexts that we come across these days. And this is also backed up by the discretion-based reporting system that is enshrined in law, right? It empowers people who are making these reports to report in this way. And it's sort of reinforced by the annual training processes that people undergo to keep up with their AML CTF obligations. The problem is that there's no feedback loop. So people just continue to pitch suspicion into the UTR-STR void about their surly or friendly or sunglasses wearing or hoodie wearing or Vanessa being clients with really no sort of recourse for people in those contexts. And we have, again, just to go into a little further, the algorithms and analytics side. And these processes in any of the identified industries, but in banking specifically, are generated from a combination of in-house services and third-party vendor purchases. So we see the development of algorithms and analytics by people who work in-house to tailor those algorithms specifically to the risk tolerances of those financial institutions. But we also see the importation of other transaction monitoring technologies that are meant to be more objective. They're related to things like name scanning, for example. With WorldCheck, and here's a quote from WorldCheck, with WorldCheck, you're screening your clients, suppliers, and partners against a high quality and strictly monitored risk database with data collated by more than 350 research analysts based in 11 research centers across 5 continents, a research team that speaks more than 60 languages, specialist research units monitoring hundreds of thousands of reputable information sources. Our researchers are bound to comply with strict research criteria and to remain objective at all times in reporting what is available in the reputable public domain. This process is subject to quality control processes and is audited regularly. These algorithms and analytics are offered as neutral, objective, immoral, unbiased, reputable detection practices that work in tandem with these human-generated UTR pieces of branch intelligence. But if you look a little further, if you scratch the surface of who or what goes into some of these lists, we can see a less than objective truth about how we understand risky identities. For example, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions here in Canada has shown that an overwhelming number of terrorist names, and I say that in scare quotes, are Muslim in nature. Now, I mean, certainly we've seen the rise of concern about Daesh and Islamic fundamentalism as key security concerns for Western democracies. But what we're not seeing on these lists are names of individuals involved in European separatist movements, narco-traffickers, and other such individuals who might fund and participate in other sorts of related terrorist activities. So even though these lists are presented as objective and immoral truths about who or what's suspicious, it's not entirely clear that they are as divorced from their political and historical contexts as we might wish to believe. So just to kind of wrap this up, I'd like to offer you in this system a couple of considerations. One is the problem of de-risking or also demarketing, as I've seen in the Canadian context, demarketing, literally pulling somebody out of the market. Some of the examples of demarketing that I've seen firsthand include demarketing of people who have been purchasing things online through transaction services that the banks did not like. People who were gambling, and I mean $50 worth of US funds, like as a one-off in online gambling, those people were kicked into the high-risk bucket. And those kinds of sort of hard and fast rules, coupled with permissive and defensive reporting, have come to create real problems for people who aren't really doing anything particularly wrongful. But because of sort of the institutional tendency toward affirming what's happening, we see encountering consequences that are not particularly favorable to them if they want to stay clients for the bank. And so sort of the de-risking and defensive reporting problem is understood in a really interesting way, I think, by people who work in financial institutions. One woman said to me when I said, you know, you're not able to tag so many of these transactions with a predicate offense, which isn't required in Canada. She was like, well, that's great. It means that they're truly unusual. And I was like, yes, it does mean that they're unusual, but just because they're unusual doesn't mean that they're suspicious, related to a criminal event, related to some sort of financial wrongdoing. That's a problem. And at a broader level, system level, it becomes a problem because we have so much static plugged into the system in Canada. Canadian convictions for money laundering are incredibly rare. Between 2012 and 2017 in Canada, 86% of charges were stayed or withdrawn. Only 9% resulted in a guilty plea. And in a year, there are hundreds of thousands of STRs generated and very few disclosures made. So for example, in 2019, there were over 386,000 STRs submitted to FINTRAC, but FINTRAC made only 2,057 disclosures. So as the numbers pile up, we're not really seeing the big payoff. And I think part of it is that we're not actually critically engaging with what's happening in the AML CTF space as reporting entities. I think what people are doing is cottoning onto something and then affirming that suspicion on the basis of neutrality or objectivity. And it's getting us really nowhere fast. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Vanessa. Again, super interesting insights, and yeah, on how suspicion is produced in this field. And lastly, not lastly, but our third speaker would be Malcolm, who also shares a slide. Okay, thank you. Looking forward to your presentation.
Is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was just saying thanks to everybody, but I'll say thanks again to Esma and the Follow team for inviting me, and to Global Digital Cultures for organizing. To maybe keep the Canadian theme going and some of the nice anecdotes that Vanessa just had, I thought to offer one of my own quick anecdotes from a talk I gave at the headquarters of the largest Canadian bank a few years ago when I was researching cryptocurrency as part of my postdoc. The bank management didn't want me to talk basically at all about the largest and original cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and only about the kind of underlying technology, blockchain, which the management was super excited about for basically improving back office processes. But it quickly dawned on me in the Q&A after the talk that basically everybody else in the bank could care less about blockchain, and were much more interested in like whether or not to invest in Bitcoin, which had lost half of its US dollar value in one of the kind of countless periods of volatility that Bitcoin and almost every other cryptocurrency has been through over the past decade or so. So this and kind of other experiences at banks confirmed to me what the anthropologist Bill Maher has written about kind of how the appeal of cryptocurrency in the ranks of bank employees stems somewhat from boredom with a lot of the de-risking that the other presentations have mentioned, and to which I'll add has been kind of increased as part of the post-2008 financial crisis regulatory thrust, and been part of this kind of yearning for something more exciting, for like re-risking opportunities after the crisis. And that's, you know, part of the reason, at least, that many financiers have gotten into this profession in the first place. Now, fast forward a few years, and things seem to be kind of reversing a little bit, at least in leading financial centers, maybe a bit less so in Canada, where you have bank management becoming less impressed with this overly hyped technology for the kind of back end of banking, and starting to move into providing a lot of front end retail cryptocurrency custody services, access to crypto funds, at least for their wealthy clients and the like. While at the same time, a lot of traders and basically everybody else in finance has kind of jumped on the blockchain bandwagon, at least as far as like the technology's potential for creating all these new virtual assets, as they're being called, kind of beyond cryptocurrencies per se. So yeah, to kind of understand this shift from, say, toxic to tantalizing, as I put it in the title, I think it's maybe important to take a step back beyond the kind of price speculation that's constantly in the news, and consider some of the other reasons that the bank managers didn't want me to talk about cryptocurrency a few years ago, starting by recalling how the original cryptocurrency is part of this longer lineage of experimentation by hackers, but also by a lot of academics in trying to come up with different ways of maintaining privacy online, including financial privacy. And these are experiments that have been overtaken over decades now with cryptographic and other kinds of technologies, giving rise to DigiCash, eCash, BitGold, and eventually in 2009, Bitcoin, whose white paper from a year earlier proposed a global electronic cash system that can allow anyone to, quote, see that someone is sending an amount to someone else, but without information linking the transaction to anyone. Essentially then, Bitcoin is designed to like frustrate, or at least render very difficult, know your customer, that banks and other financial institutions are obliged to conduct, as the previous presentations mentioned. And so really anyone can see the amount being transacted in Bitcoin, but what you can't see is who is transacting with whom exactly. Also, since this is open source code, Bitcoin has sparked this kind of ongoing series of experiments with blockchain-based financial privacy. And there's been a whole bunch of different examples of this, some of which the symbols are displayed here, and others that you can see just from the names and how they're being advertised, really clearly promote this anti-surveillance value added. What's also important here is that the technology hasn't just been a site of experimentation in financial privacy, but also in financial surveillance. So you have this public ledger of transactions that everybody can see, also forming a key source of data that is being mined by firms in this kind of ever-growing blockchain intelligence industry, where identity profiles are created to kind of narrow down potentially illicit users of cryptocurrencies. And these are efforts that are really strongly encouraged and financed by banks, by regulators around the world, who are the major clients of blockchain analytics firms like Chainalysis, which was in the news the past week or the past month, as its former chief technical counsel was just appointed as the new acting director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So at the same time as there's this kind of, you could say, more informal experimentation with the technology, there's a lot of formal experimentation with blockchain by regulators themselves. And this is both indirect in so-called sandboxes, where financial technology firms are experimenting with blockchain and other technologies in so-called like safe spaces under the supervision of like the adults in the room here being the regulators. And also we're having kind of more direct experimentation by regulators themselves that are trying to bring to life the once, quote, futuristic but realistic dream of tracking all financial flows in nearly real time, and so on and so on, from a speech here by the former Bank of England chief economist, Andrew Haldane. So in trying to kind of provide this real-time overview of transactions in ways that physical cash or coins could never provide, there's been this worldwide race to develop central bank-backed digital currencies, CBDCs. And if you kind of squint real hard at the area just north of Cuba on the map here, you'll see who the winner of this race has been in blue, which is like the first jurisdiction to launch a CBDC, which is the lovely Bahamas. And this was justified as enabling financial inclusion, something that's important in the wider Caribbean region that's been hit pretty hard by de-risking by international banks, that has left a lot of people without access to banking accounts, people and corporations as well. So the idea with this is that you don't need a bank account to hold sand dollars. You can just procure them and use them through digital wallets on your smartphone. But of course, you still need a smartphone. You also need, a phone number to contact of any surveillance practices. If you listen to the real winners of the CBDC race, as many analysts see it, which is the People's Bank of China with its digital yuan, which an ex-bank official recently claimed is, quote, not intended as a surveillance tool. We'll see about that, especially as the digital yuan is going from being trialed in major Chinese banks and financial centers to be launched for the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year. And there's already some signaling by the PBOC that the digital wallet for procuring and exchanging the digital yuan was only going to be accessible through fingerprint identification. So yeah, to I guess make sense of all this and the kind of push and pull of surveillance and anti-surveillance at the experimental site of blockchains, I wanted to make a plug for thinking about this a bit more widely within some work on infrastructures that I've been undertaking, drawing on insights also from science and technology studies, where infrastructures are less understood as just kind of things and more as relations, and specifically relations between humans and objects that don't just kind of disappear, but at the same time also don't just remain static as new technological practices come about. These practices, plug into and also kind of morph technological infrastructures. And some of the characteristics I just quickly noted there specify how infrastructural relations, they facilitate key activities like financial flows, but also surveillance. They're also open to change, despite also being quite durable over time. And as I've stressed in some other work on informational infrastructures, and especially kind of how information flows through what Bruno Latour identified as these long chains that assemble dispersed humans and non-human actors together into like really fragile relations. You have infrastructures being plagued by what I've likened to in some collaborative work to the fault lines that can lead or at least condition earthquakes. And in the case of finance, we liken this to the crises that periodically hit the sector, but also condition the responses to those crises. So just to add another almost last slide here, the kind of right column of the table here summarizes how the crisis responses to various periods of volatility over the past few decades have often led to the accumulation of new risks in infrastructures. And at the bottom right corner, we have kind of where we left off in that research in the post-crisis 2008 crisis period, where there's been a real stress on the increased collection of vast amounts of data on financial transactions, including on, but also through blockchain applications. So I guess to kind of wrap up here, my point is more that we can understand this experimentation in blockchain technologies as part of kind of this emerging infrastructure that's facilitating new types of relations, but also kind of maintaining persistent types of relations that facilitate surveillance and the accumulation of new risks in ways that might be producing new fault lines and are very likely to lead to wider instabilities that a lot of global financial regulators are hinting at these days. So with that kind of slightly dramatic warning of impending instability, maybe I'll just load up the last slide, which has some recent work elaborating on these ideas with a number of collaborators that I'd certainly point anybody interested in to explore. So thanks for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. This was again another fascinating perspective on technologies in financial surveillance, and I think we've heard a lot about that technology plays a major role, but at the same time, I think all three speakers gave a quite maybe you could say pessimistic view on the implications in a way, or maybe highlighting the problems that come with the extensive use of technologies. Let's put it like this. I mean, we've heard about the problems of experimentation, about unintended consequences. Malcolm just talked about new risk arising. So I would be curious to hear from the audience. I think some practitioners are actually also here, and they may have a different opinion, maybe another perspective on what is going on. And I think everyone or the speakers would definitely be curious to hear some perspectives and some opinions and also questions, obviously, if you have any on what has just been said. So please, the floor is open, and I look forward to receive, or we all look forward to receive some questions. And I see the first hand, which is raised by Sangeeta.
Thank you, Carola, and thank you, everyone. Just something that popped into mind when Esme was presenting, actually. Esme, you talk about sort of the rules-based transaction monitoring system and how that sort of generates false positives, and how if you have the system of if X, then you have an alert. I was just wondering, given this sort of unholy marriage of convenience between the anti-money laundering and the countering of financing of terrorism frameworks, did you see, or do you see in your research, or have you seen, when you were interning with the bank, was there any sort of nuance in how they look at these frameworks, or are they always sort of married together? Are they always sort of coupled together? Because as a practitioner at the sharp end, working for a nonprofit organization, at the sharp end of sort of de-risking decisions, time and again, I think, we sort of feel the brunt of this sort of unholy marriage of convenience and, alerts being generated and these false positives being generated. And as you say, the factors are sort of the amount or the sender or the recipient. And, terrorism financing, as you say, is also very hard to detect. So, yeah, just wondering on just wondering about your thoughts on that, on, whether there is any nuance in how financial institutions see the money laundering framework or the anti-money laundering framework and the countering of financing of terrorism framework. Thank you.
Can I just respond now? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for your question. And I think it's a very good question. Also, like the coupling of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing is often regarded as, whereas that terrorist financing was attached to the anti-money laundering framework, and it's not really quite logical as also they're very, very different things. So that just to say up front. Like, if I think about the field work that I've done within banks, and then specifically about terrorist financing, I think there's a lot of awareness that this system, or like the traditional system, does not work so well to detect terrorist financing. So I think you could say that there is consensus, at least in the fields that I have moved, that this specific type of transaction monitoring is not working. So what you can see is that for terrorist financing, there are increased efforts around public-private partnerships and financial information sharing, that you can see that the mass surveillance via this system is seen as not ideal, not effective, not efficient. And there's a move towards more targeted forms of surveillance via these partnerships, for example. So I think that's the kind of movement that I see within the sector.
Thank you. Okay, then I have another question in line that comes from Saki. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Saka. If anyone's wondering, I have also a camera a little bit down the line, which my current camera on my laptop isn't working, so I'm improvising. I'm actually one of the little black guys that was in the presentation. I work at a bank and I'm responsible for new client take-on. One question that I have, and it's because I also enjoy having this discussion a lot with my colleagues, especially the ones who have a non-Western immigration background, is the impact that our job, our new client take-on, but also in general client monitoring has on their, at least can have different kind of impacts on different communities. Already Vanessa very kindly gave us an example of her own view, and I was wondering whether Esme or Vanessa have some more examples, especially from our society. Partly also because it's something that we try to be mindful of.
Okay, thank you. Great question. Vanessa, you're going to go first?
Oh, I certainly can speak to this. I had several participants in the research who spoke specifically as visible minorities about their experiences banking other visible minorities, and how the sort of increased KYC, EDD policies meant that people sort of like self-de-risked. So people would, come in and running completely legitimate businesses, money service businesses, for example, that are legal to operate in Canada. You need your papers, obviously, to do this, but once you're above board, you're above board. But the requirements from financial institutions were so onerous, and the risk-based approach was so fever-pitched that people would just sort of self-select out and develop different kind of adaptive strategies. So sometimes they would select a bank that was understood to be more friendly. Sometimes they would nest themselves within other money service businesses. And one woman who I spoke with would say things like, said things to me like, ethnic, 100% of the names were ethnic. it was interesting, like by ethnic, she meant sort of like Middle Eastern or Muslim sounding names, I asked, because my own name is ethnic, technically. And so like these are some of the kinds of problems that we're seeing developing for people who have non-white Canadian backgrounds, shall we say, as that category kind of shifts a bit in the Canadian context, if that answers your question a bit.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for that reply, especially the fact that, well, as you mentioned, that people are changing their business structure and changing the way they operate their businesses is, well, that's an important, well, it can have an important impact on society. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Esme, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. I can briefly add, also leaving space for other questions. But I think, thank you for this question. I think it really represents a dilemma that I came across during my fieldwork very often. The dilemma between having to narrow down search results based on threat perceptions, and then like there becomes friction in the area of religious profiling or ethnic profiling, and that's really that's really a dilemma of finding typologies that on the one hand need to detect terrorist financing. Just to a brief example, during my fieldwork, many of the terrorist threats was actually, the threat perception was much focused on jihadist terrorism and foreign fighters. So this was in 2018 and 2017 when there were lots of travelers and returnees. So banks said, well, we're supposed to detect these transactions, and we're supposed to find terrorist financiers. So then there's immediately the dilemma, like, how are you going to narrow down? So I think this is this dilemma is very much in line with the question that you posed. Yeah.
Great. There's another hand raised. I think it's I peek. Sorry. Just maybe introduce yourself quickly.
Thank you, Carola. Yeah, it's Leonard Peek. Actually, we met, I think, when was it, like 2 years ago?
Sorry, you look different at that time.
Probably, yeah. I aged a bit because of the pandemic, I guess. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Marika and Esme as well. So, I'm working for the Ekman Group of Financial Intelligence Units based in Ottawa. I already heard a presentation of Vanessa on the Canadian system, so there is a link there. I want to add something here to the discussion, more of the view on the point of view of financial intelligence units, because I agree that the current system is more or less outdated, I would say. It's a very reactive system where financial institutions report a transaction that has already taken place from the past to the financial intelligence unit. They do their analysis, and it's get disseminated to law enforcement. So I'm wondering, based on your research, do you have any recommendations how to revamp the system and maybe move to more predictive systems?
That's a tricky question for critical researchers, right? But even Vanessa, Esme, Malcolm, do you have any kind of ideas on how to improve the system?
I mean, one thing that would be helpful in the Canadian context would be proactive disclosures from FINTRAC. Right now, the bulk of them are requested by very specific law enforcement agencies. And so they have to actually go with a very specified request to FINTRAC to get the data that comes out, which is, what's the polite term? It's very silly and ineffective. And so that's not efficient at all. I am hesitant, however, to advocate for things like API rollup of like, transactions in real time. That was actually suggested for a completely different purpose in Canada. They wanted in you'll have to forgive me, 2018, I believe it was. StatsCan wanted to have a sample of Canadian financial transactions rolled up to it as part of like an API real-time transaction info sharing initiative. And people were not very pleased with that for all of this privacy and transparency concerns that you might suspect. And so it's, I mean, as much as I would like there to be increased effectiveness of the system, I think it's very important, to Carola's point, that we balance the privacy rights of the overwhelming majority of people who are not engaging in the financing of terror or the laundering of funds. So.
Any additions, Esme?
Yeah, I see Marika has also raised her hand.
Yeah, we have also been another question. So, okay, let's go with Marika, and then I have also another, a second question for Saki.
Yeah, maybe you can take both questions at the same time, Carola. I think, I mean, your question is very important, of course, Leonard, concerning improvements. To be honest, for the financing of terrorism, I'm not sure that it can ever work properly in the way that we'd like to around big data, simply because there is not a long statistical historical pattern that good technologies can build on and that good models can be built with. And so in the end, what you end up with are predictable anomalies, and often they do hit migrant groups and the kinds of examples that Vanessa gave and the others. But it did lead also to my question that I had for the panel. For Esme and Vanessa, I wanted to know, so the public-private sharing partnerships have been mentioned. They work slightly differently because they don't work with big data analysis. They work with specific names that are identified by the police. So I would like to ask Vanessa and Esme how they see those developments and whether they see those as improvements and what kind of risks or problems they see there. And for Malcolm, I would also be curious to know more about this relationship between FinCEN and the blockchain industry, right? What does it mean to you that this blockchain CEO who you mentioned is now become head of FinCEN? Does it give us any clues around the future direction of FinCEN? Will FinCEN continue its strong policy of fines around the world, or do you think there will be more sort of in the direction of using smart technology for financial security questions? I just thought it was very, very interesting that you should mention this, and I wonder how you make sense of it and how you see those developments. And I know that there's limited time, so don't feel obliged to address all of those questions. I just yeah, wanted to jump in with some observations.
Thank you. And before you answer, let me bring in Saki once again, and yeah, with another question. Saki, do you want to? Okay.
I don't hear you yet.
The camera's fine though.
Now you can hear me.
Yes.
My apologies, everything froze for a bit, but now I hear you again. Yeah, I was wondering, in relation to especially some of the aspects that Vanessa and Esme mentioned, and also in further context with the other presentations, KYC to me seems to be very much a tool that people use in a more modern context for our society to access wealth in a certain sense. That's at least the role that we see a lot on our department for accessing wealth and judging whether certain wealth has been accumulated in a legitimate fashion. But because of that, I was also wondering for your critical consideration, whether whether preventing, because put simply, a lot of the arguments provided against the effectiveness of KYC is that it's not effective at detecting active terrorist financing or money laundering. However, another argument in favor of it could be that it's not so necessarily detecting it, as it is making it more difficult for people to access the system when they have well, exceptional means of gaining wealth, of collecting wealth, and when it's well, a bit more different. And because of that, I was wondering to what extent you have looked at making it more expensive to try and be a terrorist instead of preventing terrorism.
Interesting. Okay, I would propose that Malcolm, maybe you go first and address the questions that are being raised, and then Vanessa and Esme can, while they're taking notes, can answer the questions and pick some of them.
Great, yeah, sure thing. I'll just be brief because there's some other great questions that come up, and say thanks to Marika for flagging how interesting that is, this kind of overlapping human infrastructure, you could say, between the blockchain industry and I guess like the traditional financial services regulated. So yeah, I'd say like as far as policy and specifically what you ask about, like the policy of fines, on the one hand, I'd say banks better be aware that, you know, this kind of re-risking via crypto has a lot of downsides, a lot of risks to it, potential for fines. On the other hand, maybe having this kind of human personnel at a leading regulator will be more understanding of the difficulties of flagging these illicit transactions in crypto and in other kind of crypto assets. So the understanding might be there of like, okay, this is actually very, very difficult to do. We'll give you some leeway, and maybe we'll have a kind of working relationship where fines are not just like the quick, easy solution. So that's just some immediate thoughts on it, but it's definitely something interesting to see if it's kind of maintained going forward. It's also something at the global level you see with the Financial Action Task Force as well, that there's a lot of overlap between personnel in the blockchain industry and the regulators. So yeah, thanks.
So shall I answer the questions? So Leonard, thank you very much for this question. I must admit, a very uncomfortable one. I mainly researched what is happening now, and very clear recommendations are just, yeah, hard for me at this point. But I can mention a couple of things that are striking or that I have questions about, and we've been discussing also in our project. So one thing is that if you look at the amount of people that are working in the private sector, in the tech companies on this topic, and compare this to the capacity at the financial intelligence units, this is a very big difference. For example, in the Netherlands, in banks, there are 8,000 people working on anti-money laundering, and the financial intelligence unit is around 60 FTE. So I think that's a very big difference. So that's just an observation. One thing is also you can when you look at the system and when you conclude that it's inefficient, I think it's also important, especially for terrorist financing, because I didn't actively research money laundering. So my points are mainly focused on terrorist financing. It's also important to ask, like, can you even in this way, can you even like what Marika said, detect terrorist financing? And then the next question for me would also be, if it's the risk-based approach, like how much of a rest risk do you accept when it comes to different types of crime? This is an open question, right? But like many of the respondents that I interviewed mentioned, like, well, we have a risk-based approach, but there's no room for us. There's no room not to detect risks. So this is one thing that you have to discuss as a field, as a society, and also as a between the people who are working on this and the regulators, of course. And another question would be also who is responsible for this whole system, right? I think it's also a political question, like how much responsibility do you actually give to actors like banks to detect this? Then these are just a couple of things that came to mind. Then to Marike's questions about the public-private partnerships and the financial information sharing, I think just briefly based on the research that we've done, these partnerships seem to be more effective when it comes to detecting terrorist financing. But important questions also need to be raised about the proportionality, the legal questions, the ethical questions that come to mind. I think with Project Craft, you've been doing together with Maya de Hoek amazing work in outlining these questions around the partnerships. One important one, I think, is that in financial information sharing, whereby law enforcement provides names to banks so that banks can check in their systems whether these names are actually potentially financing terrorism, that it's very important to monitor this, how this is working, because this is happening outside of the how do you say, like the official criminal procedures. So this is also experimental terrain in that sense, and that needs to be carefully looked at. Then to Sake's question about the KYC and how there are also benefits. I mean, just to be clear, I'm not advocating here that nothing is working, right? I'm just focusing on terrorist financing, which is particularly difficult, and money laundering. Just to say it generally is easier, at least, than terrorist financing, and there are results there. But when you say, is the system making it more difficult for individuals to move money around? At this point, I'm not sure. I mean, many of my respondents also say, well, if they're not doing it with a bank, there are many other ways to move money. So there's a kind of, how do you say, a sort of spill or waterbed effect. So yeah, I'm not sure. And at this point, banks also really only have, they can only see the transactions that happen on their own bank accounts. So once the transaction starts moving across several banks, then yeah, the pattern is already lost. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Just to quickly add a couple things, mostly because Esme did a great job of replying to the questions. So I do want to point out that, like, in terms of, say, increasing the costs of making it more expensive to be a terrorist, it's cheap and easy. It's so cheap and easy to be a terrorist. And I say that maybe sounding a little saucy, but it's true. I mean, some very devastating terrorist events have happened funded by people's paychecks. And I'm skeptical, especially of the sort of lone wolf, small cell terrorist events, that we'll be able to detect them through financial institutions. I mean, the Boston Marathon bombing was devastating in its effects, but didn't particularly require a lot of capital to create. And so in my view, at least as regards terrorist financing, it's not going to be the way that we find most acts of terrorism, or many acts of terrorism. I think the way we're going to find that is through other kinds of digital and social surveillance technologies. But I'd be skeptical. I think it'd actually be foolish of me to say that I think we could have detected the Boston bombing, for example, as through a financial institution. It's not reasonable to to put that kind of detection onto financial institutions. Not to say that other larger scale or state-sponsored, what have you, kinds of terrorism can't be detected that way, but it seems impractical for the kinds of terrorist events that capture the public imagination, that we would be able to have financial entities detect those in a meaningful way.
Wow, yeah, thank you. These are really great answers, the great questions also being raised here. I mean, we already actually reached the end of the webinar already, and I think everybody feels like we could go on for for another hour at least. So it's good that we actually have another webinar coming up. It's so mark it in your calendars. It's going to be on the 23rd of June. And we will then focus on the role of financial intelligence units. So we move along the chain, and then from banks to the financial intelligence units. And I think, you know, a lot of connected questions will then also be raised, and maybe we have another perspective to add on that. So mark it in your calendar, as I said, and yeah, so already the end is here in a way, and then I have to thank everybody who brought this together. First of all, Marieke de Goede again for initiating the whole thing, and then to Esme who did lots of organizing work together with Asma Bafaki, and also thank you to Global Digital Cultures, to Sinin Nakle, who supported us beautifully here and also did some live tweeting along with Asma, really great work. And obviously thank you to the European Research Council, who's not here in a way, but always here in some ways. And yeah, I look forward to the next conversation. But for now, it's gonna be, for some of us, a long weekend and a sunny day to be enjoyed. So thank you everyone for participating, for spending the time with us. And yeah, see you next time.